Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint darker hair or fur in acrylics. Now the first thing I want to start off with is building up a good base foundation. Now I'm looking to map in the placement of the main lights and darks, but I must make sure that this base layer is dark. I'm not trying to use my lightest values that I can see in the reference photo. I want to be building up those layers gradually. Now as you can see here, this area is a little bit lighter, but it's still going to have that really good contrast as I continue to build, and that's because the base layer foundation is dark enough. Now when we start working with our details, one of the common issues that can happen is the details aren't showing up, and it's usually because the base layer is too light. If we're using those lighter values for the details and the base layer isn't dark enough, those brush strokes are just going to fade into the layers underneath. So it's really important to ensure that we've got as much of that realism and depth within the hair or fur, that we've got this base layer as dark as it needs to be. Now one of the other things that I think is really important is to move the brush following the direction of the hair. So even though this is very dark at this stage, I've still hinted at those main fur directional changes. Now if I felt like I had too much of the brush strokes visible and that there was more of the background showing through, then I would definitely work with a second layer. So as you can see here, I'm not using any detailed work, but I'm reinforcing that initial stage. This is making sure that again I've got it as dark as what's needed, but that I don't have any of those messy brush strokes visible. I really want to be making sure that I've got this smooth layer and it's nice and blended. Now as I start to work up with my layers here, I'm going to be focusing on my midtones. So again, I'm not jumping into my lightest details first. I'm also going to be paying very close attention to the way that the fur clumps together before I add in my finer brush strokes. Now this is going to depend on the hair or fur texture that we're painting. If that fur is more of a wiry texture, you won't necessarily have the softer clumps of fur. So of course that is going to vary depending on the reference photo and the animal that we're painting. Now as I start to work more with building up the details and texture, I want to be looking at that reference photo and paying very close attention to the right layer that I need to be working on. Now if you've got any hairs that are curving in different directions that look like they're sat on the top layers, then we do want to try to ignore those and paint what's underneath. Now a great demonstration of this is the lighter section of mane in the centre of this part that I'm painting. There I want to be saving those details where they're overlapping the darker section until the last layers. If I start painting those in now, then the darker fur that's underneath it is going to be very flat. So I really want to be paying very close attention to the individual layers and how they are built up in the painting. Now again, here I'm starting to focus on my values and gradually lightening my midtones. Now one thing that's really important here is you'll notice I'm not trying to worry about mixing the exact colour. So this looks very tan, it looks quite dull and muted. That's okay because I'm going to work with glazes as I continue to layer, and those glazes are going to significantly adjust that colour of the hair within seconds. I always prefer to adjust any of the colour portions of my paintings in separate individual stages just to make that layering process easier. Now I do have a video here on YouTube where I'm showing exactly how I use glazes, what they are in a couple of different paintings, and I'll link that tutorial in the description below if it's of interest. Now when you do work with a glaze, you must make sure that the layer of paint underneath is completely dry. If it's not dry, it's going to lift or mix in with that wet layer, and then the glaze isn't going to work. Now the one thing that's really important when working with glazes is we will be of course adding a colour over the top. So to some degree, the layers of lighter values, which I'm adding now, are going to get darker. So where I know I'm going to be using a glaze, I will lighten my mixture just slightly to cope with that glaze that will be added on top. So as I start to work with a little bit more of a smaller brush now, where I'm hinting at a little bit more of those smaller clumps of fur that are more towards the middle to top layers of those midtones, it's enabling me to really vary that texture. Now painting realistic hair or fur is all about variety. We want to have a mixture of lengths of brush strokes, the thickness of the brush strokes, and the way that they're curved and directed. You can see here how many changes in the curves there are occurring, and this is helping with that natural look. Even if hair or fur is short, there is still going to be lots of variation within that. It's more noticeable with longer hair because it has that freedom of movement, but we do want to be making sure that any changes are captured. Now, at what point I use a glaze is going to vary depending on the texture that I'm painting. So before I worked with a glaze, I've switched over here to a liner or a rigger brush where I can just hint at a little bit more of a delicate detailing on the lighter section of this mane. Now this is helping just to break up this area. There is a difference in texture and I wanted to hint at that before I had to worry about changing the colour. Now the wonderful thing about working with glazes is it's really flexible. You can use as many glazes as you want throughout the layering process. So if you were to just add one layer of lighter fur and you wanted to adjust that colour straight away, then you could dry that layer of detail and then add your glaze, add another layer of detail, wait for that to dry and add another glaze. It's really flexible and you can do that to help maximise the depth as well. So let's say for example you create a selection of brush strokes where they were a little bit too light. You look at that and you think, do you know what, I need to soften those a little bit. You can wait for that paint to dry and then add a slightly darker glaze to tint those highlights, and that will help to push those lower down, make them darker, and also help with that softness. Now, if you are working with more coarser textures, then you're usually going to have a little bit more of a jump in your values. That's going to help make that fur look a little bit more separated. Now, I've got lots of different tutorials here on YouTube that show a range of fur and hair textures because the way that we work with the layers and the brush technique is going to vary. I'll put a couple of those in the description below if they are of interest. Now, as you can see here, I'm still using that liner brush, but I'm wanting to hint at a little bit more of those subtle hairs. So I'm actually going over the top of my darker sections, and this will again help with that softness. It is important to not overdo it though, because with something like this, you want to have a nice amount of the really dark layers in between those clumps of fur showing through. This is going to really help to adjust how much depth and realism that area has. So if you start to add too many lighter brush strokes, you will of course lose those darker layers underneath. When we're building our layers like this, it's never with the aim of completely covering the layers. We want to still be making sure that sections of that show through. Now, the colour selection and mixing process is something that I talk about a lot in all of my real-time step-by-step lessons. If any of those are of interest, I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. Now, what I will be doing here is also coming back in with some darker mixture where I can just break up a few more of my lighter sections. Now, this is something where it's easier to make these changes now before you start adding your really fine details, because this is going to help adjust that fur texture or any potential mistakes that we've made. So you can see that I'm starting to break up that edge. I don't want it to be quite as solid as I had previously made it. Now, once that had all dried, this is where my first glaze is going to be used, and I start to adjust the colour of the fur that I've painted. Now, this glaze is subtle because this area of the mane is in shadow, so I wouldn't want to pull in too many vibrant colours here because I would potentially adjust the light source. Now, of course, again, this is something that is going to vary depending on the reference photo. Now, when I work with glazes, I don't just put one solid colour down everywhere. I want to be making sure that I am adjusting that as I go. Now, as you can see here, this really does make it look like I've used the right colour at each individual layer, but I haven't had to worry about mixing the right colour at each stage. The use of glazes can really simplify that process. So now that glaze layer has dried, I can start to put in a few more of the next layers of detail. Now, when working with glazes, as I've mentioned a moment ago, you don't just want to do one single glaze at the very end. I like to be working with multiple glazes so you can adjust your darker values, then you can adjust your mid-tone values and then your highlights. Now, when you start working with your top layers of detail, that's where usually I start to mix more of the exact colour, because I don't want to go through that constant process of glaze details, glaze details. We do, of course, want to get to that point where we can call the painting finished. But I might use anywhere of up to 10 to 15 glazes, sometimes more, depending on what it is that I'm painting. But I don't ever just use one or two glazes. I want to be building that up within my layering process. So it's at this stage here where I can now start to put in the hairs that are more on the very top. So I'm noticing more of those lighter details, and any hairs that are overlapping another section, I want to make sure that I put those in. This is what's helping to maximise all of that depth that we've built up from the previous layers. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in painting along to any of my real-time step-by-step lessons, I will of course link all of that in the description below. But if you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.